This is a country that when we have been in need and what we have asked for help, they've responded. They've responded by sending their young men to defend our values and our freedoms.
Somaliland is not alone at all. Let's always remember, together we are stronger.
So let's upgrade our policy. The United States of America should strengthen its position in a precarious and important part of the world. It should do the justice of honoring the consistent aspirations of millions of Somalilanders to rule themselves. And America should proudly be the first state to recognize Somaliland as an independent nation.
In 1960, Somaliland emerged independent from the British Empire after many years as the British Somaliland Protectorate. And for 5 days it was independent before it took the step to merge with what was then the trust territories of Italian Somaliland, historic Italian Somaliland.
This wasn't always the case, though. Somaliland was briefly independent in 1960 before joining the rest of Somalia. That union was ultimately rejected by the Somaliland people, but not before it was too late. The world had decided that Somaliland was indistinguishable from Somalia, no matter how Somalilanders felt. In the 1980s, rebellions against the brutal dictator in power broke out against Somalia, including in Somaliland.
Sadly, over the following 30 years, those hopes and those aspirations of what might have been were not fulfilled. And indeed, as the years progressed, the situation got worse with military dictatorships. And instead of there being a tragic situation of people being discriminated against from the north of Somalia in historic British Somaliland, actually what started to emerge was attacks upon civilians. There was mass killings where tens of thousands of Somalilanders were killed, civilians were killed. It was one of the few conflicts where fighter jets took off from cities in the area in order to bomb the cities that they'd taken off from, indiscriminately, killing thousands of civilians.
Somalia's armed forces devastated Somaliland during the fighting, practically flattening its capital city. It may, in fact, have been the only conflict in history that featured aircraft taking off from a runway in the same city they then attacked with bombs. That was just one of the cruelties of that war.
To actually discuss about the fact that Somaliland has developed so much, because in those years of conflict, where so many Somalilanders were not just in the threat of their lives, but so many hundreds of thousands were displaced, both internally within Somaliland, but also externally. That dream and that vision of actually creating their own homeland once again, re-establishing those old territorial borders, burnt bright, and that is what they actually were able to achieve in
1991, the dictatorship collapsed, but the fighting continued throughout Somalia, dragging it into failed state status for 2 decades. We're probably all familiar with the Battle of Mogadishu, better known in the US as the Black Hawk Down incident. Those awful events took place in 1993 during the period I'm describing. We might also be aware that an Al-Qaeda affiliate, Al-Shabaab, began conquering swaths of southern Somalia in the 2000s. This group, which is still powerful, had links to some of the men who perpetrated the 1998 bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. I'm recounting all this because it highlights how remarkable Somaliland's experience has been. It was and is the exception to Somalia's turmoil. After 1991, it redeclared independence and created a functioning state with its own army, passport, currency, foreign policy, and very importantly, free elections. Foreigners can walk around Hargeisa without security, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda have virtually no presence there. It's hard not to admire building a viable state amid such difficult circumstances. How Somalilanders have achieved all this is equally commendable.
This is a country that when we have been in need and what we have asked for help, they've responded. They've responded by sending their young men to defend our values and our freedoms.
They had a powerful claim for international sympathy after the devastation they suffered during the war, but they didn't wait for help from anyone else. If they had, they'd still be waiting today. No, they went instead about the business of building their country largely on their own. The clans that had been on opposite sides of the fighting reconciled, and in the process, created one of the few examples of a successful indigenous peace process. They committed to building something that was peaceful, democratic, and workable. This brings me back to why I think the U.S. and Somaliland should be strong partners. First, this territory of its own accord has stuck with the democratic system and process for 3 decades. It hasn't been perfect, just like no democratic system is perfect. But the old saying is that character is how you behave when no one is watching. Well, Somaliland has stayed faithful to democracy when hardly anyone was noticing.
In 1991, this country emerged from years of subjugation by the regime in Mogadishu. It emerged from having had their children, having had so many citizens killed in cold blood. And it was able to establish its borders once more.
This is proof of genuine belief. Second, let's envision where Somaliland sits. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a shipping choke point that carries much of the trade between Europe and Asia, is about 70 miles away. Yemen, where American allies are fighting Iranian-backed militias and Al-Qaeda, is just across the Gulf of Aden. Somaliland shares a border with Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous country, and in normal times, a landlocked economic dynamo. Somaliland's recently renovated Berbera port has great potential for boosting the economy of Ethiopia and its neighbors in East Africa. Right next door to Somaliland is Djibouti, which hosts a number of foreign military bases, including China's most prominent military footprint on the continent. To the west, and also in a commanding position on the Bab el-Mandeb, is Eritrea. In January, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Eritrea and announced a strategic partnership with that country.
It was able to put the structures in place for a legal system and elections all across Africa. We are always asking for them to have a proper legal system, to educate their boys and their girls, and to make sure there is the establishment of democracy. Well, in May of last year, you saw the parliamentary elections in Somaliland, and they were peaceful, they were calm, they were fair. You saw the rollout of iris technology, the first use of this technology anywhere on the continent of Africa, to make sure that they were fair and they were properly run.
We need to be clear-eyed about the competition we're in with the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is America's single most formidable opponent and is devoted to advocating for autocracies like itself and Russia by violating the peace and prosperity of nations that refuse to kowtow to it. America must meet this challenge with resolve. That would include a close relationship with Somaliland, given its strategic position, its pro-American orientation, and that almost alone in Africa, it's been immune to Beijing's overtures and threats. In fact, Somaliland has established ties with our Taiwanese friends, another unrecognized democracy that the United States should support. Those of you familiar with East Africa know it is a tough neighborhood. Sudan's hopeful democratic transition has been sabotaged by a coup, one of the leaders of which, by the way, was recently in Russia to strengthen ties with Putin's criminal regime. Ethiopia is caught in a terrible civil war that we also pray will end soon. Eritrea, is an international pariah and one of 5 countries that just voted against a UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Southern Somalia is paralyzed by political battles, and al-Shabaab is still strong.
All of this goes to show the maturity of this country. You've seen in Somaliland, you've seen different parties enter government and leave government, not questioning the veracity of their opponent's claim. Indeed, if I recall, there's one election, presidential election, was a margin of 80 votes. And that vote was accepted, and you saw that peaceful transition. I can't help thinking that there are some Western democracies, if a margin was quite so close, there might have been a little bit more controversy than what you saw within Somaliland.
Amid all this volatility, Somaliland has enjoyed relative calm, providing evidence that there is, in fact, fertile ground for a truly sustainable partnership. Finally, I believe, and call me crazy, that American policy is most effective when it is tethered to reality. We will see few gains in East Africa if our policy there does not account for the on-the-ground truth that Somaliland has been functionally independent for decades. Count on the Heritage Foundation for always trumpeting that fact.
Somaliland has been this amazing shining beacon of everything we want to see flourish in Africa. It is the example that we want others to follow. But they need our help and they need our assistance, because around them they see, real challenges. To the south in Somalia, you see the challenges of al-Shabaab there. You see the disorder and the difficulties in Ethiopia. You see some of the real security challenges in Djibouti.
So let's upgrade our policy. The United States of America should strengthen its position in a precarious and important part of the world. It should do the justice of honoring the consistent aspirations of millions of Somalilanders to rule themselves. And America should proudly be the first state to recognize Somaliland as an independent nation.
Somaliland is a country that wants to be our friend. It's a country that turns to us and they ask us to show leadership. So I ask my right honourable friend, instead of delivering the pre-prepared brief that no doubt every Foreign Office minister has given for the last 60 years, show some guile, show some leadership, show some imagination, show the fact that he is a politician, not merely a tool of Foreign Office officials in order to read their words. I've worked with him in the Whip's office. I sure saw some moments of merit. But actually, as politicians and this House, we need to show leadership on this issue. We need to show our friends in Somaliland that we are willing to defend them as they have defended us. So even if he cannot give us all the promises that we would like to see, even if he cannot say that we can recognize Somaliland at the dispatch box today, he needs to go away and we need to sit down and work out how we take those next steps. Because we cannot spend another 30 years pretending the reality on the ground, the existence of an independent Somaliland doesn't exist because it's not on the Foreign Office map. We need to respond to those realities. We need to lead on foreign policy. We need to show our Somaliland friends that we are there for them and that we will deliver for them. And we will not just talk about our history, but we'll talk about how we can make our history together in the future.
Stephen Daawo.